So I might have you when you're gone. When the darkness comes a-calling, I will know that I am not alone. Yeah, I will know that I am not alone. So lay your head upon my shoulder, lay your troubles on me too, and I will keep a watchful eye on the skies, and if you need me, I will carry you. I said if you need me, I will carry you. Oh love, if you need me, I will carry you.
One day I was on the street and this drunk comes up and he said, "Are you a man or a woman?" And for once I had a ready quip. I said, "Are you an asshole or an idiot?" And funny thing is, he laughed. You get out there and you're running with your dog and you get a tremendous adrenaline rush. My mother was a dog breeder. I went to dog shows with her when I was 7, 8. I don't know who took the picture, but I called that photo my mother and her little guy. I was athletic, hated dating boys, and resented pretending I was less than they were. I fought so hard to find a form for who I wanted to be. Gender was so policed. You couldn't stand a certain way, you couldn't talk a certain way, you couldn't wear certain, it's like, oh. I always felt ugly. I just couldn't pull it off, you know, what I was supposed to do and be. I was really a failure as a girl.
Human babies are born with the ability to grow up as members of any society.
Reading Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa was my introduction to the critique of culture.
The pattern
Ours.
of living, and learn to carry it out obediently and precisely.
Her voice had reached into my teenage hell. I remember lying on my bed in tears, saying to myself, everything is relative. Everything is relative. This life you're encased in is not the only option. There's other options.
Traditional notion of anthropology is you study something so distant, so foreign, the other. What Esther does is that, you know, the other is actually around you. It's in the Midwest, the heartland.
I was totally enthralled. I felt like I had been a female impersonator my whole life. That made me realize that gender roles are malleable. I did not foresee the impact it would have over time, because when it was published, it just bombed.
Esther was not playing the game. Esther was not doing anthropology in the way that she was supposed to. She was way ahead of her time. What can you say?
The kinds of conclusions and observations she made would also be true today, even as drag has grown and evolved.
Because of my background, coming out in 1959, every place to me is gay or straight.
And here to tell us about this fascinating town is Dr. Esther Newton.
Cherry Grove, I discovered, was a place that I loved. How did these gay men and lesbians turn this place into the fantasy land that everyone has talked about?
Welcome to the invasion!
Why do anthropologists do the work we do? For me, that's always been emotional connection. You know, that I fell in love with these people.
She's writing an anthropological study of herself.
People will be learning from her for a long time to come. Esther was really part of a vanguard, not just a founding member of the faculty of the college, but really a founding member of lesbian, gay, now queer studies.
So the first duty of any queer person is to survive.
The first duty of any queer person is to survive. That, watching that in that trailer almost brought me to tears, because we've lived it all. So hello, ALBW, wherever you are, and welcome to what I hope is going to be a wonderful interview with Esther Newton. Cannot wait to get her in here. But before we do, a couple of things that I want to chat about very briefly is a little background on Esther. She, as you've seen from the clip from her documentary, she has spent a good portion of her life fighting for our rights as an anthropologist, as an educator, and as an activist. And I couldn't be happier to have her here today. Now, we have a ton of stuff to cover, as always. And if we don't get to all of it, I do want you to know that Esther is going to be at ALBW. She has her very own workshop, and that is on Thursday, April 7th from 10 to 11:30 in the Cahill rooms. And the last thing I want to tell you is, for my striped shirt crew out there today, I am wearing my very snappy Black Watch flannel shirt in honor of my inner Butch. So why don't we bring in the amazing Esther Newton, former SUNY Purchase professor, Emirata, right, because she's former, distinguished anthropologist, gender studies pioneer, LGBTQI activist, and author of 4 books. So, Esther, come on in. How are you?
I'm good.
Good. We both have our flannel shirts on. That's
We
very
do. We do. Flannel shirt dykes.
So, Esther, we, as I've said before, we have a ton of stuff to get started. But the place I'd like to start with you is I'd like for you to define Butch for the audience.
Okay, here's a brief definition, which is that Butch is an identity within the lesbian community that fuses female masculinity with homosexual desire.
Okay, now this term is not, it's not an historic term going anywhere past the beginning of the 20th century. And part of what we're going to spend our time on this morning is talking about how that actually came about. So when we talk about Ann Lister, for example, now she's known as the first modern lesbian, and there's even a blue plaque out there that honors her in that role. But the fact of the matter is the word lesbian didn't exist at that time, nor did the word butch. So how did this all get started? You do a wonderful job of defining the starting point for this in the paper that you published entitled The Mythic Mannish Lesbian, Radclyffe Hall and the New Woman. So let's walk through that quickly in terms of, you make some really strong points about how we got from the end of the 19th century with romantic friendships, et cetera, all the way into the 20th. So, Steph, can you put up that image of our suffragist friends and we'll get started? There we go.
Okay, so about 50 years ago, lesbian feminist historians were really trying to reconstruct lesbian history in a way that had never been done before. And they described the 19th century 2 types of relationships, which were called romantic friendships and Boston marriages. Those were different because romantic friendships were strong feelings between women that happened at like girls' schools and so on. And Boston marriages were adult women who actually became life partners. Now, in both those cases, the historians said, well, we can't know what these people did. The word lesbian didn't exist. Can we call them lesbians? So this became a big history problem. So my paper sort of starts off from there and stresses the point that these two types of relationships were kind of okay socially. People weren't made into women weren't made into outcasts because of them, because all women except for prostitutes were considered to be asexual. Like the medical experts of the time were like, women don't have any sexual desire, or hardly any. Sexual desire was supposed to be a male thing, a masculine thing. So what happened was, at the end of the 19th century, Freud and other sexologists began to describe these romantic friends and Boston marriage relationships as what we now call homosexual, which is a term that Freud used, much to the displeasure of these women who didn't want to accept that identity. But younger women who were coming of age in the 1900s saw these women that for instance, you saw the picture of, as old-fashioned. They wanted to become known as sexual beings.
So we really had two different things going on there, didn't we? We had sort of the rise of, well, there were the suffragists who were trying to get the vote for us.
Right.
And then we also had, ensconced in that, really the roots of feminism.
Well, the suffragists were the roots of feminism.
Exactly.
But you also had the roots of lesbianism, because that word, I'm not talking about whether women were actually having sex or not, because now we know they were in the 19th century.
Right.
But it's rather that, like the Gertrude Steins and the Radclyffe Halls, these people, they wanted to claim a sexuality. They wanted to be known as sexual. So how could the ones who had homoerotic feelings, how could they do this? And the key figure in this was Radclyffe Hall, who you just saw with her partner in that picture, Una Trowbridge. And she was the mannish lesbian who was identified by the sexologists as being masculine and therefore having sexual desire.
Right. So, because she couldn't have it in the eyes of sexologists. And I do want to throw in here the point, you and I chatted about this briefly during our discussion, that once again, women were being defined by men.
Absolutely.
All of this comes out of studies done by men, not by women, in terms of whether or not we were sexual, non-sexual, lesbian, straight, whatever.
Right.
Completely annoying. So along comes Radclyffe Hall, and she's part of this new cohort of women that are saying, hold on a second. We're moving into the 20th century here. We have rights, we have sexual desire, and we want people to know it. But there was another point to it too, which is, in order to recognize someone who was similar to you with those feelings, right?
Right.
So tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, the mannish lesbian, that figure that was made famous by Radclyffe Hall in The Well of Loneliness,
right,
was not only the one who had sexual desire, she was the one that you could recognize as a lesbian.
Right.
So how do you know that someone's a lesbian? It's because they're masculine.
Right. And so I'd like to spend a little bit more time on Radclyffe Hall and some of the things that she went through in her life, because part of what started to push this forward, really just as it is today, was technology. When Radclyffe Hall originally published The Well of Loneliness, was right around the time when the media was really starting to use images.
1928.
Yeah. So now we have full-scale images of Radclyffe Hall all dressed up in her gig.
By the way, she's wearing a skirt.
I noticed that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Gertrude Stein too. She wore skirts.
Yeah. Interesting. So it was,
So it was like not, it wasn't a full, they weren't trying to pass. That's my point. They weren't trying to pass as men.
right. They were establishing their own identities.
Exactly.
Yeah. Huge point for all of us.
Yeah.
And so you've got this generation that's coming in. Radclyffe Hall publishes The Well of Loneliness, and I'm sure that many of you who are listening to this or watching this interview have read that book. I know I did. It was one of the first books I found when I was coming out back in the late 1960s, and it still sells tens of thousands of copies a day, or not a day, a year. Even at this point, it's really amazing. But Radclyffe Hall really suffered for her publishing, didn't she?
Well, the book was declared obscene by the British government, and she went to the trial and she didn't get to say anything, but her lawyer argued that the relationship pictured in The Well of Loneliness was simply romantic friends. And afterwards, when they went out to lunch, a break in the trial, supposedly Radclyffe Hall was in tears. She said, that goes against everything I was trying to do.
Wow.
She wanted it to be even though it's very, two sentences,
right?
Sort of drawing the veil over the fact that they had sex. She insisted that this was a sexual a depiction of a sexual relationship.
Right.
But she was, unbelievable. And those of you who know some of the 19th century history, it was kind of like the trial of Oscar Wilde, he was sent to prison,
right.
But she couldn't be sent to prison. She wasn't accused of acts. They hadn't caught her in any acts. She was accused of writing an obscene book. And so she didn't go to prison. And there was no law against female homosexuality because, as you said, Pat, Queen Victoria is said to have felt that it was absurd. Nothing like that could exist.
Right. Women wouldn't do that.
Women would do that.
Oh, yes, we would. So here we are with Radclyffe Hall. What was the outcome of that? She didn't go to jail. The book was banned?
It was banned, yeah.
Right. And when did it first get actually published in the US then? I was actually surprised. I remember seeing the date in your paper, but now I can't remember. Was it 28 that they published it, or was it in the 40s?
It was published, it was banned in England.
Right.
The publishers, recognizing they had a good thing, smuggled the plates. That's how books used to be made. I won't go into that, but smuggled the way to make it into France. And the French started publishing it and selling it, like crazy.
Oh, no kidding. Huh.
Yeah. And then it had an American publisher, and it was published in 1929, threatened to be, I think there was a suit brought that it was obscene, and the judge said no, that it was covered by the First Amendment. So it was available in the United States from 1929, never been out of print to this day.
That's amazing. So the protagonist of this book is a female.
Yes.
Born female.
Yep.
But named Stephen by her father, correct?
Correct.
Right. So now we have this highly publicized, talk about a great way to get book sales, by the way.
Totally.
Yeah. Highly publicized trial, including pictures of Radclyffe Hall dressed up in definitely in what passes for butch attire at that point.
Yep.
And establishing the fact that there are, in fact, women out there who fit someplace else on what we now call the spectrum.
Correct.
And what happened from that is obviously that gave voice to a lot of other women out there who were trying to find their own place in the world.
Right.
Along with also Gertrude Stein also was part of that, kind of in that same time period and moving
they knew each other. They knew each other. They would go back and forth from lunch. I don't think probably Gertrude Stein liked Radclyffe Hall. I'm guessing very different temperaments and interests.
Yeah.
But all these women, Natalie Barney, there was this group of wealthy women who could, do as they pleased, basically.
Right.
And
Virginia Woolf.
Virginia Woolf,
Yeah.
right? She testified at the. Wait a minute, did she testify? She was asked to. I think she did testify at the trial because they brought in these literary, heavyweights.
Wow.
To testify that it wasn't obscene.
Wow,
So,
I didn't know that. We hadn't talked about that earlier. That's really interesting.
Oh yeah, and she, by the way, you asked about what happened. That trial was devastating to her. They after that they basically spent much more time on the continent. They didn't stay in England much.
Oh, yeah. One of the interesting outgrowths of all of that, though, is that even after Radclyffe Hall died, and she died at a fairly early age, I believe in her 60s.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, which is a shame. But Una Trowbridge kept right on going with female lovers, correct?
I am not sure that I actually read her memoir, which is kind of self-serving. I'm not sure she ever had another partner.
Oh, okay. I thought I read something about that. But
they had a threesome. I mean, this is
well,
little side path. Yeah, Radclyffe Hall got involved with a nurse type of person, and Radclyffe Hall was, I don't know, like the Shiv did After Dark gals said, that that Ann Lister could be not so nice. Oh, Radclyffe Hall wasn't so nice to Una.
Oh, got it. Okay, understood. So again, because we have so much to cover, we're going to jump now into the middle part of the 20th century. And we've had this kind of underground growth of feminism in a particular form that certainly got a boost during World War II when women were allowed to go to work.
True.
And assume their own identities and create their own agency, make money, pay for their own goods. And so we have this kind of climbing up this way. We also have lesbianism becoming more of a known fact. Discussed fact.
Well, banned fact.
Banned fact. Better word. Thank you. Right. So certainly for those of us who were kind of coming of age in, say, the 60s, the 50s and 60s, because that was your time, Esther, mostly what we had to rely on were those, remember all those paperback books?
Oh, God love them.
Oh, no kidding. I remember going into Croc and Botanos, which was a bookstore in the Chicago area, and sneaking a couple of those out in a pile of other books that I was purchasing, as one did.
As one did.
As one did. Yeah. So anyway, here we are. Feminism starts to take off. And one of the outgrowths of feminism was more conversation about lesbianism, not in a positive way. We have gay liberation taking off at the end of the 60s and into the 70s. And now we have feminists who are willing to step forward and let people know that they're lesbians. We didn't get a great reaction to that from the rest of the feminists. And in fact, when the National Organization of Women was founded, they refused to let us be part of their club. And so a wonderful group of feminists decided that they were going to take matters into their own hands. And they decided to attend some of those meetings. And Steph, you can throw that picture up. The famous Lavender Menaces. I have one of those T-shirts stuck away someplace. And that person on the left, for those of you who are sort of in my age group and Esther's age group, that's a very young Rita Mae Brown, another great lesbian author. So here we were. Now we're battling within our own gender, or our own side of male and female, because we only had two to choose from back then. You can drop that picture, Steph. And The problem is we weren't being accepted by the women that were now taking their politics forward. So we started to develop into a split that wasn't so much fun. We were still being thought of as sick. So let's talk a little bit about that issue in the DSM.
Yes, well, ever since Freud and Kraft-Ebing and these people, homosexuality had been categorized as an illness, a mental illness. And that got incorporated into the American Psychiatric and Psychological Associations, both.
Right.
And I don't know if this is, Pat, you and I never discussed this, but I, as an adolescent, was just barely escaped being committed to a mental asylum, and instead, luckily, was able to see a psychotherapist who, with incredible good fortune, was actually, he's the first person I ever told I thought I was a homosexual.
Wow.
At 16. And he was supportive.
Wow.
But that was really rare. Mostly it was kind of, also it was like the gold rush, there's gold in them there hills, and boy, we can make a lot of money trying to cure these homosexuals.
Yeah.
And so one of the most important actions of the gay movement after gay liberation was getting homosexuality taken out of the manual of diseases.
Yes.
Which happened in 1973. So
yeah.
that was a really big deal. But
I was very active in gay politics back then. I'm about 10 years younger than you are, but we are on a similar track.
Yeah.
And that was a huge moment when that was dropped.
It was.
Yeah. So now we're kind of set in an era when both women and as feminists and lesbians are much more in view. But this is also a point when those women who carried or put on the mantle of Butch and carried that forward became more visible. And as a part of, I just want to touch on this briefly, Esther, but as a part of what came out of gay liberation and the women's movement on our side of the fence was the fact that many women felt more comfortable about being public about their butchness. I'm not saying they felt safer, but they were more likely to display themselves as butch. And many of you have heard me on several occasions do exactly what I'm going to do now, which is to thank those women, because they were carrying us forward well before we were. It's a lot of courageous people out there that we're claiming, and I say the same thing about the queens too, by the way.
Well, I think with the rise of lesbian feminism, which came out of gay liberation, to bring this back to the Butch issue in a different way, the lesbian feminist movement was predicated on the idea, on a redefinition of what a lesbian is. So instead of the sicko that the shrinks had been saying, actually in the Woman Identified Woman, which was the manifesto they put out at that demonstration against being excluded from now, they said the lesbian is the rage of all women. So suddenly, there was this tremendously, of course, my phone, of course, would ring right now. It was this tremendously clever move to redefine, that we're not sick isolates. We're the vanguard. We are the real women. And the thing that happened was that Butch-femme culture, which up until then had been the predominant strain of lesbian culture
Mm-hmm.
was put down. It was like, oh, this is just a model of heterosexuality, because those two ideas of who a lesbian is didn't fit very well.
Right. Yeah.
And one thing I want to say about this, and this paper that I wrote, The Mythic Mannish Lesbian, was writing against that idea that Butch-femme is just a recreation of heterosexuality, and that it's, butches are, if they want to be, why do they have to act like men and all this other stuff? And one thing I really want to put in here is that the lesbian feminist movement was a largely middle-class movement. And that people were rebelling against that. Lots of those middle-class people dropped out of school and all this, but it still was a largely middle-class movement. And a key aspect of this is my analysis, of the denigration of butch-femme culture within lesbianism was, in my opinion, class prejudice. And that butch-femme gendering, that whole culture, was predominant among working class lesbians, Black, brown, white. It was also common among upper class lesbians, but that's another story.
Mm-hmm.
So terms like diesel dyke or truck driver, these were class slurs, these were class put downs. And then it's also true that not all working class lesbians embraced feminism.
True. Oh,
I
absolutely.
interviewed people like that in Cherry Grove who were like, I never saw the point,
Yep.
So that split, it amplified a split that was already there between middle class lesbians and working class lesbians.
Yeah. You're bringing up some things that I'd forgotten about after all this time, but you're absolutely 100% correct. There was, the drama and strife that came out of during that whole feminist period, growth of feminism and lesbianism and gay liberation back in the 70s was huge. And the arguments that we would have amongst one another that made no sense whatsoever. I think it's hard for people now to understand exactly what it took to get to where we are now. And that has an impact on the conversations that we have now.
Yes.
As we move further into LGBTQI studies. But I want to bring this back around because I don't want to miss talking about you specifically. And because you and I, Esther, one thing I know, you and I could go on here for the next 5 hours because we have already.
We have.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about you, Esther, you and your life. So how did this all happen for you in terms of your own coming out?
Well, I was born in 1940, and actually, I was from the start, I was very, wanted to be a boy and was interested in boy things and toy soldiers and
cowboys.
Cowboys, yeah. Cowboys. And actually, my parents were, at that point, didn't have any objection to that, really. And my problems really started big time. And when I was 11, we moved to California. And my parents had divorced. And my mother moved the two of us back to California. And it was, we lived in a city, Palo Alto, which those of you who are American will know it's the home of Hewlett Packard, and it's Silicon Valley now. At the time, that was kind of just in the early stages of that. It was incredible. I was a New York kid, had gone to progressive schools, and I could wear my little jeans and T-shirt and baseball hat, and suddenly everything was the 1950s and utter conformity, gender roles to the max.
Yeah.
I mean, pedal to the metal, crinolines, all this. And I was like, oh my God, what? And I just, it was torture, really, for me. And then on top of all the gender conformity, I began to become conscious of the fact when I was 14 or 15 that, hey, I'm really attracted to women, teachers or classmates. And so eventually, well, yeah,
Yeah, there you are.
that's me. I was about, at that point, I was a camp counselor, I guess. I guess I was 11 or 12, something like that.
On the right side, the picture of you on your knee,
Yeah,
kissing.
that one, the one on the prince.
Yeah.
The prince and the princess. We were both there, butches and femmes. So I just, I had a horrible time of it in Palo Alto, and eventually, when I was 16, I went to boarding school, which was much better. But by that time, and to come back to the well of loneliness, a friend of mine had lent me a copy of the Well of Loneliness in a brown paper bag. And I read it and I thought, oh my God, this is who I am, this mannish lesbian person. And also my hair was kind of on fire, like, oh my God, this is who I am. Like, what kind of life?
Yeah.
What kind of life can I have?
Yeah.
So I really tried to be straight. I made strenuous efforts to be straight and gender conforming as best I could.
And you talk about that in your memoir, and I do want to touch on that. So you dated, you sort of got engaged at some point.
No, did get engaged.
There you go.
Not sort of. It only lasted a few weeks, but
right. We all tried.
I tried. I just couldn't make it work.
Yeah. And in terms of how you styled yourself, how you dressed, you wore a bit of makeup here and there, right? Lipstick, all the rest of the general stuff that one was expected to do.
Correct.
And at this point, you're starting to move into a career.
Right.
So talk a little bit about that. You're in college. And you're starting to decide, or you've decided what path you're going to take, which is anthropology, correct?
Well, I didn't decide that till my senior year in college, but
okay.
Yeah, I mean, I knew I didn't want to be a secretary, options were so limited. I think it's so hard for people today to realize just where, first of all, lesbians and gay men, our lives were, and our sexuality were illegal.
Yeah.
In every state. There was no internet, so how did you find out anything, or how did you meet people?
Yeah.
It was just really so horrible, so restricted. And
those restrictions, I just want to put a little tiny little story in here from my own experience. We were dealing with restrictions of being gay, but at the same time, there were still restrictions on us as women, as we all know.
Yes.
I remember going into a bar in Bloomington, Indiana, and with some friends sitting at the bar, and I walked in and started to stand by them, and I was told point blank, I could not stand in that bar. I had to take a seat. This wasn't a gay bar, it was a straight bar. It was illegal for a woman to stand in a bar.
That's correct.
Crazy. Yeah.
It's terrible. So, but I was very good in school. I had always been very good in school. And I knew I didn't want those other, nurse or secretary or any of those. So the academic world was just beginning to open to women.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided I would become an anthropologist. And so I went to graduate school at the University of Chicago to do that. But the thing of it is, the relevant point here is that no way could you possibly be out.
Right.
No way. Several people I knew had been kicked out of college. I was kicked out of my dorm because of suspected homosexuality.
Oh, you didn't tell me that before. No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow.
I was kicked out of an honors dorm and it was like and the irony is the dean who kicked me out, she was a lesbian.
Of course.
It's like, what?
Yeah.
The world was so full of these.
They were so, Esther, the generation that came before us was so frightened about being found, which was part of what gay liberation was about. They were so frightened about being found out that they were the ones that would come after you.
Sometimes they would, just like she did. I will say she didn't expel me from school.
Good.
Point
taken.
The thing of it is, the point is here that in order to have a career like that and also be a homosexual, you had to live this completely hidden life.
Right, which included how you presented yourself to others.
Yes,
dress, style.
Back to the mannish lesbian.
Yep.
And when I was in graduate school, I was told by the faculty that you wear pants too much, it means you're not committed to anthropology. I mean, that's how, it was no joke.
It's insane. So Mother Camp, your groundbreaking book, which as we'll talk about here in a minute, Esther says was a flop originally. I read this book when it was published. I was part of Gay Liberation and a group of a mixed group, men and women. A couple of drag queens were part of my little circle of friends, and somebody brought it home. We were all living together in a house. So talk a little bit about Mother Camp.
Well, I was just coming out again into gay life, and because I had run away from it, wanting to stay in college and not be persecuted more, and I was just coming at all secret.
Of course.
And I went to this drag club in Chicago and saw this drag queen who was like, oh my God, this is fantastic and wonderful and fabulous. And so I met him, I introduced myself to him, and he was this just wonderful person that I came to love. And he gave me an entree into this world. And my mentor in graduate school, who was also a wonderful man, encouraged me to write my dissertation about it. And I thought, well, because I'm not writing about lesbians, they can't really accuse me of being gay. As I wrote in my memoir, if I had really realized how much it would hurt my career to do that, maybe I wouldn't have done it. But in the long view, I'm very happy that I did it.
Yeah. And it really was, I personally think that Mother Camp really started gender studies.
It certainly was a foundation document of gender studies. It was the first anthropological description of the gay community in America, because I was looking at female impersonators who at the time were completely outcast. Forget about RuPaul or anything like that.
Oh, Jesus, no, yeah.
It only took place in private parties and sleazy nightclubs, but was really integrated into the gay community. And so my book wound up being a description not only of their performances in their life, but also of the gay community more broadly. Right.
And that's yet this is my problem, Esther. Every time we start talking, there's all these paths to go on. But it really, that particular point that you just made, it's one of the things that it's an ongoing conversation about as the gay community or the LGBTQI community assimilates into the world. I'm more than happy to take a stand saying we've lost a lot in that assimilation.
That is true.
We have lost a lot. And personally, I hate to see it go, because that community early on in the gay liberation movement, there was a slogan that came out: "An army of lovers cannot be defeated." Remember that?
I do.
Absolutely. And I wish we had some more of that now.
Yeah.
So when did you first start? And I'm kind of curious, did your work with drag queens, did that have any impact on how you started to present yourself more butch publicly? Or did that happen before, happen after? Because you started to, wear the clothes, walk the walk, talk the talk. Here we go. The androgynes of early early gay liberation and feminism.
Yeah, that was more the androgynous look. I first was introduced to Butch-femme culture when I was 19.
Uh-huh.
I was seduced by this femme woman,
Ah.
fortunately for me, and she introduced me to working class bars in New York City, and it was all Butch-femme, and clearly I wasn't femme. So, and I accepted that, but then this happened over a summer. At the end of the summer, I was like, I can't go back to school looking like this. I mean, I had my Lucky Strikes in my pocket and I had my sleeves rolled up. I had men's pants.
Yeah. Did you have your ace comb in your back pocket?
I don't remember that one. Maybe.
No, that was a big thing back in yeah.
So it's like if I wanted to continue, and here we come back to the class thing.
Yeah.
Because being in college, much more so then than now, was strictly a middle class and upper class thing.
True. Yes.
And I was going to go back to college as a working class butch. No way.
Yeah. Wow.
No way.
Yeah.
And then I would have wound up like an elevator operator, like Bebo Brinker was. She had, So I had to run away from all that.
Yeah.
And I really didn't come back to it fully until 1981. So that was 21 years later.
Wow. And what was, and again, there's so much that we're leaving out here, everybody, and I really hope you get to Esther's workshop. But so what was the impetus there? What happened in 1981?
What happened in 1981 was I had been struggling with this, trying to figure out certain things sexually and still kind of ashamed of my masculinity. And in 1981, I met a woman and fell in love with a woman named Amber Hollabaugh.
Mm-hmm.
She had written this great essay, still so relevant, called "What We're Rolling Around in Bed With."
Exactly. Yeah.
And I read that thing and I was like, every hair stood up on end. It was like, I can't believe this. It just spoke to me so much. And then, of course, we got in a relationship, and that really solidified my sense of myself as butch.
And Esther, you and I have chatted a lot about this from the perspective of the realizations that came to you when you fully accepted yourself as butch. And one of the more interesting comments that you made to me was discovering the erotic power of the butch. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, this goes back to the power of the image, the symbol of the mannish lesbian, which from the beginning was associated with outrageous and forbidden sexual desire. And the butch, I argue, is the most important symbol of lesbianism.
Mm.
And as such, she embodies tremendous erotic power. And I don't mean by this that every lesbian is attracted to butches. Of course not, although quite a few, fortunately, are. But there's so much power in symbols, the American flag, or the Queen of England. She's a human being, but she's also a symbol.
Right.
And as that symbol, people hate her, love her, have many other thoughts and so on. And so the butch lesbian, especially who really is comfortable and accepts it, has a tremendous erotic charge that other people like bounce off of, and in various ways, positive and negative.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's, that is it's such an interesting part of the discussion, and maybe we'll get into it a little bit more in the workshop, but I shared with you that was one of the outgrowths of Gentleman Jack out of the rise of our community as it's discovered, and Lister, et cetera, was the idea of reclaiming, and this is age centric. I would be willing to guess that most of the people that are listening, if they are, that are under the age of 30, this is like foreign territory to them. But the idea that one could accept that part of themselves as being more masculine, finding that point of attraction with other women, and displaying it in such a way, rather than constantly hiding it, right?
Right.
Always absolutely afraid that someone's going to think badly of you because you might display what we call a more masculine side. And I would love to get rid of that term masculine, because it keeps going back to men and women. And I don't, I think that we live in a different category. That's a whole other discussion. So one of the other things that you, in talking about the role of the butch, you also said that you wanted to say something about femmes, and this would be the time for us to do that.
This is the time. Absolutely. This is the time. And really, femmes, some of whom identified, clearly as femmes, and others who are just feminine in various ways. I grew up, as I said, feeling ugly and unworthy of love. And I only realized I was good looking, lovable, and desirable, seeing myself through their desire for me. And I think femmes are in a very difficult position because they are usually able to pass. And that comes with a big downside. The downside is that they're not legible as lesbians.
Interesting. Yeah.
So when you're femme, you have to almost wear a button that says, I'm queer, or I'm a lesbian, or whatever. And of course, some of this also is connected to the historic advantages of masculinity over femininity. And I think femmes often can feel discounted, or are discounted. And this is a terrible mistake, because femmes really rock, and they're really tough. My second femme lover that I met that summer that I came out in the bars, she said to me, and she was she had been an underwater dance, water dancer or something. And she said to me, I've never fucked a man. I never would. Cool.
Wow. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. All right, I'm here.
But really what you're describing is the torturous journey that so many of us have been through in the last 50 years, as I just described, in terms of coming to terms with our own inner butch. And meanwhile, we have our femmes over here who are looking for those butches over there, but we're not seeing them because they're not presenting themselves as lesbians. I mean, it has been a real mess over the last 50 years. So I just want to say this. For everybody that keeps wanting to have this discussion about gender and spectrum and everything else, don't give us a hard time, because believe me, we've lived through it and it ain't been easy. But we want to know, we want to learn, we want to support you, we want to move on. But I want to point out one thing when we get to that, and we aren't going to get to the subject of transgender today, because that is an entirely different subject for an entirely different person to be sitting across from me. But I do want to remind people that the very first even inkling any of us in this particular age group had that there was such a thing was a very courageous person known as Christine Jorgensen. Christine Jorgensen hit the newspapers when she underwent the first sex change operation, as we used to call it back then. And I want to share with you all that I actually had the privilege, honor, experience of sitting down and talking with Christine Jorgensen back in, I think it was 1972. She came to Indiana University, where I was, involved in gay liberation and journalism. And so I was sent off to interview her, and really a very nice person. But what I find interesting is now she's being held up as this sort of icon of in the LGBTQI movement. But I asked her point blank, I said, so what do you think about all this that's going on with gay liberation? She looked me straight in the eye. She said, I'm not talking about that. I am not a homosexual. And this interview is over. And she got up and she walked out of the room. So I want to sort of close with this part of our discussion about that as underscoring the complications of the conversations we're all trying to have right now about all of this, butch, femme, transgender, whatever it is. We're working towards a way to communicate with one another, but it all has to be in context. Would you agree with that?
Which context are you thinking of?
The context of where we all come from when we're sitting across from each other having a conversation.
Where we all come from is one of the most important things about any of us, not only as individuals, but also as a movement.
Yeah.
We'll never understand why things are the way they are today if we don't understand how we got there.
Yeah, but we do all understand that for most of the history of the world, there were two choices, and one of those choices, being male, ran roughshod over the rest of us. And the last 50 years and the next couple of hundred going forward is all about healing all of us from all of that. So, Esther, I'd like to take some time because I know there's going to be people out there that have a couple of questions here and there. So let me just see what we've got. And we are running very close to the end, so I apologize to anybody that we're not going to get in here. But again, there is a workshop from Patricia Book. In what way did your authenticity negatively affect your career as an anthropologist in the long run?
My authenticity is how?
Authenticity as being butch.
Well, I didn't have an easy road in anthropology and in the academic world. I was discriminated against. I was fired once, almost fired again.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't come out. That is, letting it be known that I was a lesbian until 1974, because after I got tenure, honestly, that's when it made the difference. And then I started really much more openly mentoring gay students, offering classes that were, both on feminism and also LGBT stuff, and but it still took me another almost a decade to say to really arrive at the most authentic place,
right,
for myself.
And how does that feel to you now? What's life like in your community? At least in the winter, you're in a gay community. You're in a gay community in Florida, right?
Well, it's lesbian.
Lesbian, thank you. Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is a whole other fascinating subject, but a lot of the mystique or whatever of butch is you can do, and you do it well. When you're 81, you can do as many things,
right,
as you
right.
did. So that that affects self-confidence and that I don't think that's really been explored.
Yeah.
How you can feel undermined in that specific identity.
Yeah.
Because of the problems of old age.
I totally understand where you're going with this, because at some point physically you're just not performing you're not performing the role anymore, and people have to help you, right?
Oh, Pat, you and I are, on the same.
Yeah.
wavelength.
Soul sisters, right?
Yep.
Here's one more question for you, and then we're going to come to an end. Where do you, as far as, it's an interesting question. What's the future for butches and trans men? They're holding separate places on the spectrum, right?
Well, the trans movement is very new, relatively speaking. And so as I think always when new movements emerge, there's sharp distinctions are made. We're not like them, we're like this. I think that in the future, with the rise of non-binary people,
right,
identifying that way and everything, that there's going to be more of a spectrum of trans. I already know some people who call themselves trans butches.
Interesting.
And so I think there'll be more of a spectrum of
even just within that piece.
Right. Of sort of queer identified masculine people.
Right.
That's my guess about where it's going to go.
I say bring it on. The whole non-binary thing, I love it. I just, why do we have to keep plugging ourselves into these, all as little round pegs trying to plug ourselves into square holes, right? Or vice versa.
Well, I like some of those holes, or I wouldn't be clinging to Butch.
Oh, there you go.
There are advantages to labels and identities, big advantages.
Yeah.
And there's also downsides.
Yeah. Well, Esther, I think we'll pick this up back at the workshop, but I want to thank you for coming on today. I just, again, for the probably 7 hours we put in talking about this, we haven't even scratched the surface. There's so much to talk about, but I really want to thank you for coming on, and I really look forward to seeing you in Halifax.
Oh boy, devoutly to be wished. And hello to everybody out there. Whether you can make it to Halifax or not, keep the faith.
Yeah. Thank you, Esther. And thank you for everything that you've done for us. Esther Newton, pioneer. What a gal. So I want to thank my team, as always, Steph and Kat in the background today, and always doing that fabulous job. In 2 weeks, we're going to be back with the fabulous Jill Liddington. And Jill has a new edition of her book coming out. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some of the parts of Female Fortune that we're going to probably be seeing in season 2. So if you want a couple of ideas about what may be coming up on that screen, make sure you tune in. And in 7 weeks, guess what happens? I can't tell you how excited I am about this. It has been such a long time that we've been working on Ann Lister Birthday Week. And, you can fall into just sort of a path that says, well, one of these days it'll get here. I just realized yesterday it's 7 weeks away. And I cannot wait to welcome you all in the Minster on that first Saturday night. And I do hope if you're coming that you're buying tickets for that, because that really is our kickoff. It's going to be the first time we're all together. I guarantee you are going to feel a sense of energy in that building that you can't even begin to understand right now. But let me just tell you this. It's why I'm sitting here in front of you, and it's why I created ALBW, just to give you that opportunity. So please join me there. So in the meantime, thank you all for listening. See you in a couple of weeks, and see you in Halifax. Hi, Pat Esgate, lead organizer for Ann Lister Birthday Week, happening next April 2 through 9 in Halifax, and I hope you'll come and enjoy it with the rest of our great ALBW crew. See you in Halifax.